What is up, guys? Welcome to another video on my YouTube channel. My name is Parsa. I'm a third-year medical student at Georgetown. And this past February, I took and passed Step 1. Now, if you look across the internet, you will see hundreds of thousands of videos talking about Step 1 resources to use, this timeline to schedule, how exactly to study. And this video isn't necessarily that. This video is my experience and my timeline and exactly how I studied for the USMLE Step 1 exam. Having said that, if any of what I did resonates with you and you want to explore that, I highly recommend that you do, because this is something that worked for me and I think it can work for you. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump straight into the video, and we'll start off by talking about what resources I used exactly. My primary source of studying was UWorld. Now, UWorld is a question bank with thousands of questions for USMLE Step 1, and my goal throughout the study process was to finish the entire question bank. With UWorld being my primary study method, I made sure that with every time I did UWorld, I was keeping track of the questions I got wrong, and I was actively learning from it. A lot of people judge their prospective performance on Step 1 based on their UWorld scores, and I completely disagree with that. I think UWorld is a very strong learning tool, but you should be judging your progress towards getting a pass on Step 1 with another resource that we'll talk about later. Next up, I used Anki to consolidate facts on questions that I got wrong on my UWorld. Using Anki, I was able to actually search through and find UWorld question IDs from my incorrects, unsuspend those cards, and try and consolidate that information. Anki became kind of a peripheral resource that I used throughout my dedicated. I would only really use it when I was like on the treadmill or like waiting in line for something. It wasn't really something that I was really heavy on. I would do somewhere in the region between 200 to 300 cards a day, and that was really it. In terms of review videos, the ones that I used, I focused on Pathoma chapters 1 through 3. The reason I did these 3 chapters was because I thought that if I could understand all the fundamentals of pathology, I would be set for the exam. Because when you break it down, all of your system-specific questions on pathology will all foil down to your basic level pathology. For example, if I had a question on sarcoidosis and the question stem was just leading me to that diagnosis, it's asking a lot about what is the pathophysiology of this, and I understand how granuloma formation works. And that's all the material that's covered in Pathoma chapters 1 through 3. In addition to that, I also focused very heavily on Sketchy Micro. Now, the reason I picked these 2 resources to go really hard on is because a majority of the content on Step 1 is focused on pathology and microbiology. And if you understand those 2 portions really well, you have a very, very solid foundation going. I think the resource that was most important for me, especially, was the High Guru Prep Step 1 Pass-Fail course. Now, this is one that's not a traditional resource that med students use. And honestly, I wasn't too familiar with it at all either until I actually had a conversation with Dr. Rahul Damania. He is the founder and the creator of High Guru Prep, and he is a phenomenal human being, and I cannot speak highly of him. I'll go ahead and link his Instagram and his TikTok and everything below, because you should definitely check him out. And the High Guru Step 1 Pass-Fail course, in my experience, was really, really good because it was a lecture, but it was also super case-based and active. So throughout his lectures, he would be asking questions and you'd be trying to like do the active recall thing. And then after he'd go over the case, he'd break down, all right, on the USMLE, this is that keyword that's buzzing you towards this. This is how the pathophysiology works. This is how we treat it. This is how we do all these things. And he did a really good job of taking one case and expanding upon it so you knew everything you needed to know about all the things related to that condition, and then also related conditions. Finally, the last resource that I was using was CBSSA NBME exams. Like I mentioned before, UWorld isn't a great gauge of how you will perform on your actual Step 1 exam, but the NBMEs are really, really important. Now, what was really nice is that my school actually gave us 3 CBSE exams administered in person. So I took those for free, and then I paid for exam 33, 32, and 31. So I took a total of 6 NBME exams. One last note about resources is that some people tend to like to use a lot more resources. Some people use dirty medicine and go through the entire thing. Some people use the Randy Neal biostat. Some people use a ton of stuff. And yeah, I tried everything out for a little bit and I just didn't really love those. So I always came back to kind of my focused resources, which were UWorld, High Guru, and Anki. My general advice for resources is to find 3 to 4 resources that are reliable for you and they work really well. Okay, enough about resources. Let's move on to talking about how I scheduled out my entire prep. Now, my step 1 prep actually started at the beginning of my second year. I took the entirety of my first year M1 summer off to pursue research, to travel, to have a little bit of fun. I was keeping up with some light Anki here and there, but it wasn't anything serious. Now, throughout second year, I made a commitment to myself that I was going to do 5 to 10 questions of UWorld every day, mixed block on concepts that we had covered during my first year. In my mind, this was a great way to start re-exposing myself to some of the content back from my first year, so I didn't have to relearn it all from scratch. After every question block, I'd sit down with those question IDs and I'd write down the question ID and why I got a question wrong or right. In addition, whenever I had a block exam coming up for my second year, I actually went through UWorld and completed the questions pertaining to that block. Next thing you know, it is December 27th, which was the official first day of my dedicated. My dedicated was mapped out to be a 47-day dedicated, so I took my exam on February 13th. Now, the first 2 weeks were a heavy review-focused weeks. So week 1 was heavy Pathoma chapters 1 through 3 and sketchy microbe with an additional 40 questions of UWorld scheduled into there. At this point, I had already completed about 25% of UWorld, so I mapped it out and I was having to average somewhere between 80 and 120 questions a day to complete the entire thing before I took step 1. Week 2 was the goal was to finish Pathoma and sketchy, and I would do 80 UWorld questions a day. I think it's important to note that at this stage, I was doing all my UWorld questions on tutored and untimed. Also at this point was my first CBSE exam of my dedicated phase. We had taken a CBSE before, and I had scored a 50% before dedicated started. Within a week and a half of dedicated, I had already bumped my score up to a 64%, which was a really solid improvement, which put me at about a 90% chance of passing step 1 within a week. Week 3, we increased the intensity some more. This time I was all UWorld all the time. I finished 120 to 160 questions on tutored and untimed mode every single day. And I took another CBSE exam, NBME, whatever you want to call it. This was form 30 and I completed it and I scored a 64 again. At this stage, I wasn't too worried, but I was a little bit disappointed that my score hadn't gone up from the first exam. At least I knew that I was being pretty consistent and that first exam score wasn't a fluke. Around this time as well is when I actually had the conversation with Dr. Damania about what to do next. And this is when I began incorporating High Guru into my prep strategy. So if I took a practice exam on a Thursday, Friday would be the day I reviewed, Saturday would be the day that I would go through all the questions I missed, figure out, hey, what am I missing the most here? What concept and topics am I missing consistently? And I would use that Saturday morning to supplement my review by going through the High Guru lectures associated with the system that I was struggling with the most. And actually, there was a stark difference between my second and my third CBSE as a result of this. So my strategy became a lot more systems targeted, and I think that helped me a lot. But also at this stage, I was feeling extremely burnt out. I was only 3 weeks into my dedicated, and I was already feeling extremely tired. I want to make it known that for these first 3 weeks, I was studying anywhere in the region between 8 and 10 hours a day, on top of making social media content, documenting my process, going to the gym, doing all these other things that I was responsible for. And I remember having a conversation with my mom who told me, "You look like shit." And this is kind of where I realized in dedicated, it's important to sometimes find moments to take your foot off the gas, take a break, and enjoy some time. So I did pivot my schedule a little bit so that my weekends were more review oriented, whereas the middle of the week was more going to be the heavy questions. So continuing on, I feel like I found a good balance. I felt recharged after that weekend 3. Going into week 4, 120 to 160 questions daily, reviewing the questions in the afternoon, doing a little bit of light Anki here and there. And on this next CBSE exam, I actually did up my score to a 68%, meaning I was at a 95% chance of passing step 1 within a week. And let me tell you, that felt good, but I still wanted to give myself an even larger margin of success. So week 5 comes, it's a kind of a similar process, doing UWorld questions during the week. Friday comes, take form 33 On Form 33, I scored a 68%. Again, very consistent from the last one, but again, I'm not seeing that next level improvement. So heading into week 6, we are getting to within 10 days of exam day. And this is when I realized that I had made a mistake. I got another call with Dr. Damania. I was asking him, hey, I feel like I'm in a good spot. 95% chance of passing is very strong, but I want to give myself a little bit of that extra threshold, a little bit of that extra comfort. And he goes, well, how have you been doing your UWorld? And I tell him I've been doing it on studied mode and on tutor mode and untimed. And he said, well, why would you do that? You're not practicing how you're meant to play. And all of a sudden it clicked that, in reality, I probably should have been doing a lot more untutored and timed practice to get myself into that exam condition. And the unfortunate thing was I didn't have a lot of questions left to practice with. At this point, after doing 120 questions a day for a few weeks, I had almost completed the entire question bank, which is pretty freaking insane to think about. 3,000 questions. So for the last few hundred questions on the question bank, I was really making it like test condition. And by the time I took Form 32 on Super Bowl Sunday, I had scored a 74%, which is a 99% chance of passing Step 1 within a week. So I felt really good going into my last week of Step 1 dedicated. However, I am a person where I thrive off of good momentum. So I knew that I couldn't let that last week be a big rest week for me. I decided that I was going to continue taking practice tests so that I could fully be locked in for game day. This is kind of that whole mentality of practice how you play that I hadn't done enough of in my studies up to that point. So I took the old free 120. I scored an 80 on it on the Monday before my test day. On the Tuesday, I took a UWorld self-assessment, and on that one, I believe I scored a 72. Reviewed that on the Wednesday. Finally, on Thursday, I went and took the real free 120 at home, and on that one, I scored a 74 as well. And that takes us to February 13th, test day. Now, one thing they don't tell you about Step 1 exam compared to all other exams that you've probably taken up to this point in your career, whether it be the ACT, the SAT, or the MCAT, is that you aren't brought back into a room with everyone at the same time. My test time was at 8:30. I showed up there at 8 just to give myself a little bit of a buffer of time, and I didn't get that buffer. They said, okay, you ready to go? And I'm like, yeah. And I went back and took the exam. Now, I know the formats are a little bit different now, so I only want to comment on what my experience was like taking it 40 questions at a time. And if I'm being quite honest, doing 40 questions at a time is very tiring. I felt like I had to use a break between each section, at least just get up, get a drink of water, and then come back to my working station. In terms of other day of exam things, I made sure to pack plenty of high protein snacks. So I focused on, protein bars. I brought some chomps. I even got some candy, like sour strips. Those are my favorite. Packed 2 energy drinks and plenty of water. Really, I just needed stuff to keep me hydrated, keep me awake, and make sure I was getting a good filling meal or snack just in between my sections. My strategy going into the exam was to take no more than 30 seconds going through the question on my first time seeing it. If within 30 seconds I could identify what was going on, I knew it and I moved on. If it took me longer than 30 seconds, I would flag it and I would come back to it at a later point. I feel like this did help me a lot with my time management on each section, and I never felt really rushed going through my sections. Not a lot of people talk about the actual aftermath of the Step 1 exam. Most people just talk about the day of in itself. And so when I got out of that exam that afternoon, after that initial feeling of being mentally exhausted wore off, that feeling of, oh God, did I fail this exam, started to creep in. And for a few days after, I started to remember some of the questions that I was struggling with on the actual exam. And I would go back and review those questions. It got really bad. And thankfully, by the grace of God, I passed step one. I found out I passed step one actually about 10 days after I took it, which is a very fast turnaround, and I'm very pleased that it was that quick. Now, while I passed step one and while I felt pretty confident that what I had done was the right approach, there are still some mistakes that I would go back if I was doing it again, and I would look to improve from. The first would be that practice how you play approach, the untutored and timed questions on UWorld. I think that had I done more practice in that style, I would have gone into my actual test day with more experience, and I wouldn't have had to stress so much on that last week of exams, taking a lot more practice exams and simulating exam conditions more. The second mistake I think I made was not reviewing my sketchy micro and my pathoma 1 through 3 earlier. Now, I'm glad that I did it at all, but I think it would have saved me a lot of mental energy in those first 3 weeks where I was starting to experience some of that burnout. And on the topic of that burnout, my third mistake was treating step one prep like a sprint and not a marathon. I think for me that I really wanted to try and take step one as early as possible, but I had scheduled it for a lot later. And so I was studying super hard for 21 days, really pushing myself, even though I had a full other 26 days to continue to review and work on things. I think that if I had taken a little bit more of a balanced approach, I wouldn't have felt so tired by the end of the prep. Naturally, you're going to feel tired. You work so hard, you put in so many hours of studying. So in summary, my recommendation is to not overcomplicate things with your step one prep. Find some resources that you really enjoy. Find a question bank of your liking, whether it's UWorld or Amboss or something else, and go through the entire question bank. Pay attention to the keywords that are used in question stems, how they present the material on the exam. You'll start to recognize that patterns emerge very easily on these step one exams. Be consistent in your work. I think the biggest thing that step one teaches you is how to stay disciplined rather than relying on motivation. It's really easy to lose motivation during the step one process, but it's on you for the sake of your future patients to push through that motivation, stay disciplined, and keep showing up doing the same things over and over and over again. There's a saying that I love where it's harder to be consistently good than occasionally great. The last thing I learned through this step one dedicated process is that dedicated is actually a lot of fun, because dedicated is the last time that you have your schedule entirely to yourself. You can build your schedule around everything that you need to do for the day. Say, for example, I needed to go get in a workout in the morning. I wanted to hang out with friends in the evening after a long day of studying. I could do that because I'm not on anyone else's time. This is again where that discipline and that consistency kind of come back. And I documented my entire process so you guys could see everything that I was doing. You guys could see my scores. You can track along with my progress. I'll leave links to my Instagram and my TikTok down below so you can follow me on those platforms. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'll be trying to upload new videos every single week documenting my life in medical school. And with that being said, go out there, do good in the world, save people's lives, and take care of yourself. See ya.